I think I see some familiar faces in the participants, which is exciting. And then I see some people that I don't know, which is also very exciting. So happy to share results with both groups of people. Just to get us started, I know, of course, many people are tuning in because you research or manage caves, but I do want to give some quick facts and definitions for people who are maybe less familiar with caves. So when I'm talking about caves today, I'm talking about these landscape features that form by erosion in the southeastern United States. We're usually talking about this weak acid eroding limestone in particular. And I'm really contrasting this to like man-made mines or culverts, which we won't talk about much today. And then there's some gray area in this definition, but I'm generally talking about underground areas that are big enough that a person could get in there. So, of course, there are like cracks in rocks that small animals could get in. I mean, we wouldn't call them a cave if a person also can get in there. So we're talking about like pretty big features usually for the purposes of this talk. Um, there are thousands of caves in the southeastern United States, and they range from a few feet long or deep to hundreds of miles, like Mammoth Cave. And some have, huge vertical pits that require rappelling and rope climbing gear to get in and out of. Some are so small that people can only crawl in the passages. Some of them visited for hundreds of years, or maybe get thousands of visitors per year, and then some of them have still to be yet to be discovered or mapped by people. So really, there's a huge diversity of caves and cave systems, and they're all as unique as snowflakes. So even though these are these really abundant landscape features, we might not think about them often because they're out of sight. But they really do have these important functions for our region, for many different interest groups. And I'm just going to give you a couple of those reasons. So caves provide critical habitat for biodiversity, and that includes endangered species, rare species, species that provide important ecosystem services, such as bats. Caves provide critical groundwater storage in these karsty regions, so they do play important roles in mitigating drought and flood risks. And then caves also provide recreation opportunities for thousands of people like me. And that also generates revenue through ecotourism. And so this could be through commercial caves, like where people pay to visit the cave, or by cavers who are visiting undeveloped caves recreationally. There are many different people tasked with protecting these ecosystems and their associated ecosystem services, including people who own or manage lands with caves. So they could do one or both. So this includes federal and state governments like the National Forest Service, the National Park Service, and state resource offices. It includes NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, the Southeastern Cave Conservancy, and the National Geological Society, and then also a lot of private landowners. And we work with all of those groups for our Southeast Cave microclimate project, including partners from Alabama, Arkansas, Kentucky, North Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Georgia. So these are, extremely dedicated people working with limited resources to conserve caves for current and future generations, and we're really fortunate to work with them on this project. I listed them on the previous slide. I'll talk about them again later. I can't show photos of all of them, but here are just a few of them in action to give you some idea of the effort that they put into these jobs. We also have this big academic team. So Matt Niemiller from the University of Alabama in Huntsville actually has an entire army of graduate students who are passionate about cave science and joined us on a lot of trips. And I couldn't fit them all on this slide, but here are some of the main academic people who help collect data and analyze data for the project. And I just want to emphasize that today I'm the figurehead who gets to share some of the results, but lots and lots of people worked on this project. So here is the first graph. So we're going to spend most of the time today talking about what factors control cave climate so that we can better manage caves during climate change. But first, I just want to emphasize why climate change is even important for caves. So relative to surface habitats in temperate regions, caves have less variable or more stable temperatures. So on the right, you're seeing a plot from one of our Tennessee caves where we had a logger outside the cave monitoring the surface temperature, and then a logger inside the cave in a stable dark zone. And you can see the surface is varying from around 5C to 30C across seasons, and there's also diurnal changes. But then the dark zone of the cave is consistently around 15C. It almost looks like a flat line at this scale. So this is a typical pattern in temperate zones, and that means that many caves are a warmer refugia for species to avoid freezing in the winter, and then they're a cooler refugia for species to avoid heat or heat stress in the summer. And then caves also have consistently high humidity, which can mean that they're a refugia for species that are sensitive to desiccation. So some species move in and out of caves seasonally, and then others are only found in caves all the time, and they've evolved this obligate dependency on caves. Often this happened like as glaciers receded and caves became the only remaining habitat refugia for some species. Um, so one reason why climate change might be an issue then for cave ecosystems is that these species have evolved to live or use these very predictable, consistent environments, and they might not be able to adapt fast enough to rapidly changing climates. If you work on caves at all, you probably know this rule of thumb that the mean annual temperature of caves in a region is the same as the mean annual surface temperature, or MST, in a region. So the prediction is that if we increase the mean annual surface temperature via climate change, then the mean annual cave temperatures will also increase. Although there will be a lag of some years before the actual like rock or earth temperatures warm to those surface temperatures. But this rule of thumb can be a little overgeneralized sometimes in the way that we use it. So sometimes we tend to think about it like this or overgeneralize like this and assume that if we have 4 caves in an area, they're all going to have the same mean temperature as the mean annual surface temperature. So something like this. But in reality, like few or none of the caves might have the exact same average as the surface. So they might be a little warmer or a little colder, depending on various factors that we're going to cover later in the webinar. And this variation between caves is actually critical for biodiversity. So it's one prominent example. We know that the mean annual surface temperature in the Southeast and the broader Eastern United States is actually too warm for bat hibernation. So bats only hibernate in caves that are colder than that average. And so in this like hypothetical cartoon example that I've given here, bats can only hibernate below this blue line temperature, and so they could only hibernate in cave 2. So the concern then is that if we increase the mean annual surface temperature via climate change, we'll also increase the average for all of the caves. So we don't know exactly how that will impact cave 2, but it is possible that this cave switches from being ideal for bat hibernation to being too hot for bat hibernation. It'll be above that line. And of course, if this cave were a major hibernacula for one of our threatened species, this could devastate a population or even the whole species. So one thing that we want to talk about today is what kinds of naturally occurring conditions or management actions might help some caves to be resistant to climate change. So maybe their mean temperature doesn't increase or doesn't increase as much, even as the surface temperature is increasing in that region. And we're going to talk about these average cave temperatures a lot today. But I also want to point out that there is variability within any given cave around that average. So even in the simplest caves, there tend to be gradients. For example, a common pattern that we see in the winter is that locations closer to the entrance are colder and more variable, whereas locations further from the entrance are warmer and more stable. And so this is an example of microclimates, or these consistent temperature and humidity conditions that occur at the sub-cave scale. And we know that cave-associated species will preferentially choose certain microclimates. You'll find them in some places and not other places. So again, using bats as our example, we know that some bat species, like eastern small-footed bats and big brown bats, like to hibernate in the colder microclimates near the entrances, and then like little brown bats and tricolor bats tend to roost in warmer microclimates, and so we rarely see these species in the same passages or rooms in a cave. And this is particularly important because we know that warmer microclimates favor disease and mortality in bats. So since 2006, cave hibernating bats in the US and Canada have been infected by an invasive fungal pathogen that causes white nose syndrome, and that is often fatal. And millions of bats have died from this disease during hibernation. And we know that bats that roost in relatively warm microsites in caves, like again our little brown bats and our tricolor bats, have had the most severe population declines, losing more than 80% of individuals. And this pattern seems to be driven in large part by temperature-dependent fungal growth. So the fungus is growing faster at warmer temperatures, and then is probably causing more pathology for bats that are roosting at those warmer temperatures. And when we've documented these temperatures and fungal growth in the field, we know that we're not seeing bats roosting at temperatures that are near the maximum for fungal growth, and probably bats can't actually hibernate at those temperatures anyways. So it does seem like if all the microclimates in caves get just a little bit warmer, the fungus is probably going to grow faster and cause more mortality. And so that does suggest that climate change could exacerbate the disease impacts for bats. It is hard to know how changing surface temperatures in a region are going to impact one specific room in a specific cave where bats are roosting. But again, today we want to talk about what are the options to maybe pinpoint some important microclimates or microsites within caves and then help them to resist changes. So as the surface temperatures are warming, we don't see changes or as big of changes in those really important microsites. I'm using a lot of cave hibernating bat examples because many of these species are threatened or they're species of concern in the southeast. And so most cave managers have bat monitoring and management plans. But climate change affects, far more cave-associated species than just bats. And so this is this great meta-analysis that documents how climate change is already impacting things like animal physiology and behavior and population dynamics for all cave-associated species, vertebrate and invertebrate. And sometimes there are these amazing historical data sets going back decades to document these impacts. So since this great work already exists, the focus of this webinar isn't to document how climate change is impacting cave biota, but rather to talk about evidence-based management options to respond to these potential impacts or to prevent them from happening. So the first thing that we did was to go to our many cave management partners and ask them what they're already doing related to climate mitigation or climate resilience. And we actually found that none of them were explicitly managing for climate resistance or resilience in cave ecosystems. So many told us that climate resilience was important to their organization, but they didn't know what they could do to improve climate resistance or resilience because there was just so little scientific evidence available to support those decisions. And then others reported that climate resilience wasn't something that they were prioritizing, given, the other demands on their time and resources. But they would be open to ideas about how to incorporate climate resilience management strategies if it fit into what they were already doing. So that's kind of the landscape that we were working with at the beginning of this project. And so what we've been doing is working together to create a management toolbox, including general tools and information that apply across the region, as well as specific tools and information that our partners can apply to their specific caves. So for specific caves, we do, of course, want to know how species distributions are tied to their specific cave climates or microclimates, such as how bats only occur in specific microclimates during hibernation. So, many of our partners just needed to know, like, where are the species in relation to the temperature and humidity patterns in their caves. And then we do want to know what natural conditions influence cave climates or microclimates, including their resistance to changing with surface conditions. And then also what actions managers can take or should avoid due to their impacts on microclimates. And then when we can't prevent cave climates from changing, we want to know what actions we can take to help cave-associated species to be more resilient in the face of climate change. And then, of course, we also need to know about any supporting actions that would make any of the rest of this possible, like monitoring or conservation action plans, things like that. So we used a mixed methods approach to build this toolbox, including having our management partners help us co-develop a list of all possible management actions that could intentionally or unintentionally influence Cape microclimates, systematically reviewing the literature for evidence for these actions or missing actions that weren't on our list. And then also collecting and analyzing our own data from cases across the region. And I'm briefly going to discuss each of those methods before we dive into the toolbox itself. So across the whole project duration from 2022 to present, we've worked with around 70 different cave owners or managers or scientists from the organizations listed here. And we had 5 virtual partner summit meetings to bring these people together to provide ideas and feedback on the project design, execution, and interpretation to make sure that the data that we were collecting would actually be useful for future management decisions. And at one of those partner summit meetings, we did divide people into breakout rooms and ask them to list all possible management actions that could impact cave climates or microclimates, biological resistance to climate change, or any supporting actions. So kind of all the things on our little diagram. And we specifically asked people to include things that they might do on purpose, or they might do without intending to change the climate, but there could be those unintended impacts. And we also ask people to give us options that are just hypothetical, even if they didn't know if any data were available to support them. So then the next thing we did was we wanted to see what evidence existed to support this list of actions, and again, to fill in any actions that we were maybe missing from our list. So we did a systematic literature review focusing on all factors that influence cave climates or microclimates, including management actions. And we performed a really broad search in Web of Science and other databases to try to find all the papers potentially relevant to this question. So we look for any papers that had the term cave and then something about temperature or climate. And we did also test other iterations like humidity and other climate terms, but that didn't really seem to influence our search output. As you might imagine, we were getting a bunch of stuff that wasn't really relevant, and so we did exclude papers from the search if they had this whole list of terms here. I'm not going to go into most of that because it's trivial, but I do want to point out that we did specifically exclude anything about cave dwellings, cave art, or archaeological preservation. We also excluded paleoclimate studies, like using speleothems for like figuring out the climate thousands of years ago. And then we didn't include ice caves, marine caves, or caves on other planets or on the moon. But even though our focus is on the southeastern United States, we did include information on caves from anywhere in the world, as long as they were not ice caves or marine caves. So based on all those search terms, we found 1,617 potential studies to include. And we read the titles and abstracts of all of those. And then using the R package Metagear, we have multiple people rank the abstracts based on some inclusion or exclusion criteria. So again, we were looking for papers about factors that influence cave climates or microclimates. So we would include it if it looked like they did include that and exclude it if it didn't. And again, we had this list of exclusion criteria. And in the end, we ended up with 261 studies we thought were likely to meet our inclusion criteria. We read the full text of all of those and ended up just keeping 178 that definitely included something about factors that influence cave climates or microclimates. And then from those 178 papers, we extracted a bunch of data, some of which we'll share today. That included recording which kind of microclimate or climate variables were measured in the study, which factors they measured that influence climates or microclimates, and then also anything that they measured or reported or suggested about management actions. And then finally, our third method, so that was all based on expert knowledge and previously published work, but this third method was to collect new data from caves across the southeastern United States. So our partners gave us this huge list of potential caves that they own or manage that we could select from, and it's shown in gray on the little histograms here. And then we used stratified random sampling to pick caves across gradients of latitude and forest cover, which were two variables that we thought could impact cave climates. And we put data loggers in all of these caves, and then we did systematic biodiversity surveys in half of the caves. So all caves had one hobo temperature logger that was placed outside of the cave. There was another hobo temperature logger that was placed in the twilight zone. So this area where some surface light is still visible. This is often where we see the most biodiversity in any given cave. And then we put this one wet bulb psychrometer in the dark zone where there's no detectable outside light. And this measures both temperature and humidity. And then in case it did have a significant stream, so this is just a subset of caves, we also put a stream logger that would measure temperature and depth as well. And all of these loggers were taking a measurement every hour, and they did this for several years in the longest case. And so this is a massive amount of data, and we're still working to organize and analyze some of it. But we're excited to share some preliminary results with you guys today. And then for our biosurvey caves, which again were just half of the caves, we also picked random distances from the entrance of the cave. And then at each point, we conducted an area-constrained biodiversity survey while recording how long we searched for. We also took additional temperature readings at each of these search areas so we could really relate the microclimates in the cave to the biodiversity that we're seeing. And we also did some opportunistic sampling between transects as we move through the cave. So using these methods, we've seen nearly 400 taxa across all our caves. Unfortunately, Matt and also Eric are great photographers. You can see some of these species here. Around 1/4 of the species are cave obligate, meaning that they can only be found in caves. And because caves like this are, little islands on the landscape, and most of these species have limited dispersal, these species tend to be endemic to just our region and often just few caves or maybe even just one cave in the region. We counted and identified what we could in the field, but most of the species are really small invertebrates that require taxonomic keys and a microscope or even genetic sequencing for identification. So we took a lot of photos and some specimens, which has really taken us years to sort through. And again, we can't share all the biosurvey results in this webinar, but I am going to give you a quick story just to highlight some of the awesome cave species. So Bobcat Cave in Alabama has been surveyed for cave life many times by experts in the past. But during one of the Alabama team's trips for this project, they discovered a second species of blind cavefish in the cave, and it's so evolutionarily distinct from the other species that's there that it's actually a new genus, and it's not known from anywhere else. So this is a really neat case where this extreme adaptation to cave environments seems to have occurred independently in these two fish in this one aquifer. So this paper is going to be coming out in scientific reports, so you'll be able to read more about it there. Okay, let's talk about some toolbox results. From those 178 papers that matched our search criteria, I'm listing the climate variables that they measured from most common to least common. So the most common measured climate variables were temperature or spatiotemporal temperature variability, like seasonal changes in temperature. And then the next most common were things related to humidity or vapor pressure. In contrast, relatively few papers measured airflow or wind speed, and even fewer measured water temperature. And then few to no measured anything related to like risks or rates of freezing, temperatures dropping below freezing, or droughts. And the limited attention to these sort of climate extremes likely reflects the relatively short duration of most cave climate data sets. So only 28 papers out of 178 included a time series longer than 5 years, and most time series were shorter than 2 years. So that's common in ecological studies, but obviously limits our understanding in some cases. And now I'm showing you from most of these common all the factors that people measured that could impact cave climates or microclimates. The most common things by far were something related to the surface temperature, whether that be the seasonal changes, diurnal changes, or most commonly the mean annual surface temperature. And in most of these test relationships, the analyses were observational and correlational, right? So they're just relating observed changes on the surface to observed changes underground, for example, and only 39 total papers explicitly tested how management action impacted cave climates or microclimates. And among those, the most common management actions tested were altering how visitation rates or changing cave entrances or airflow impacted climates or microclimates, usually specifically temperature. So obviously there's a lot of complexity here. A lot of these things are related to each other. So if we focus just on temperature, which again was the most commonly measured variable, One way to look at this is to divide it up by factors that influence the surface temperature, again, either the mean or seasonal or diurnal variation. And then the differences that we see between caves, like comparing the mean of the cave to the mean annual surface temperature, or the differences that we see within caves. So, once we have some kind of mean temperature in a cave, what determines why some rooms or passages are warmer or colder than the others. So for surface temperature, some key factors are latitude, elevation, and season, or again, like diurnal changes. And these all have big impacts, and these are things that we've known about for a long time. But I think we sometimes overestimate how predictive they can actually be for cave climates. So for example, here are our logger data. So they're up to 3 points per cave. So one each for the surface logger, the twilight logger, and the dark zone logger. And you can see that the average temperature recorded by the different loggers does decline with increasing latitude, which is what we would expect. But there's also a lot of variability around any given latitude and that average temperature. And so some of that variability is going to be explained by depth and elevation and other factors. But some of it is factors that we might have some control over. And that might be a reason to hope that there's something that we can do here for climate resistance or resilience. When we get to the differences between caves, some of the most notable factors were things that influence airflow or water flow. Both of those can influence air temperature. And most commonly it was things like the entrance size or shape or orientation or the passage size or shape. And so that includes things like gating or other entrance modifications. And those could be things that accidentally or purposefully change airflow in climates. And a few studies had looked at how forest cover impacts cave climates, but it's always been quite a messy result, and it's been unclear if forest cover really does play a big role in mediating microclimates relative to surface temperatures. With our data set, we do see that the caves that have the highest percent forest cover in a 1 kilometer buffer are colder than the mean average surface temperature, so they tend to be more often below this 0 line here on average. So forest cover does seem to be mediating cave climates. There is, again, a lot of variability here. And part of that is that this model isn't accounting for all kinds of other variables that impact cave climates. But this is potentially exciting news because it means that reforesting or conserving forest cover could be a climate management action. But ideally, what we'd like to do is some future analyses or look at how changes in forest cover over time, either increases or decreases, have impact cave climates in a given cave. And then finally, there are these factors that influence temperatures on the scale smaller than the cave, like how temperatures are more stable the further or deeper into a cave that you go. There's actually been quite a lot of research on how human visitation or artificial light impact temperatures in individual rooms and passages. And of course, that is something that managers can regulate. And then more recently, there are these new interventions related to trying to cool particular rooms or microsites within caves or mines to reduce temperature on a small scale and make conditions more favorable for hibernating bats. And intervention studies have shown that this can increase bat counts in the manipulated sites. So that's this Turner et al. Paper that I'm showing down here. So this type of intervention has been a little bit controversial, in part because people are worried about the possible repercussions of changing these sensitive ecosystems, such as negative impacts on other cave-associated species. And there's also concern that these interventions might change temperatures throughout an entire cave and not just one small area or micro habitat. And so, of course, these are important considerations, and that's why no one is suggesting that these interventions are appropriate for all caves or mines. They're just one tool in this toolbox. And right now, people are mostly using them or considering cave cooling in two cases. So it seems like one is to manipulate caves or mines that have always been like too warm for bats or maybe other species, and they're trying to turn them into new suitable habitats. And then the other case is to try to reverse past modifications that have made temperatures less favorable to bats. So, for example, in this study at one site, they had previously put in an entrance door that made the temperature warmer. And so the intervention was to replace that entrance door with a bat-friendly gate instead. And that changed the entrance morphology and thus the airflow and thus the temperature. So if we come back to our toolbox here, we see that management actions can impact cave climates in many different ways, including unintentionally. And some of this has been known, of course, for a long time, and that's what has led people to design, for example, better cave gates that don't change airflow or bat access to sites. But some of it is relatively new, like the potential implications of conserving forest cover or these new interventions about hibernacula cooling. And our goal is for this final toolbox, when we publish it, we'll document the evidence and consideration for these different actions, providing a quick guide for managers who are trying to avoid altering climates with management decisions or taking actions to make caves more resistant to climate change. And we didn't talk about this as much today, again, just because we don't have time to go into all of the biodiversity information. But in some cases, it isn't feasible or socially acceptable to try to maintain or modify climates in a particular cave. So we also compiled a list of all the actions that can help populations and species that use caves to persist in the face of changing climates. I'm just listing a couple of them here. So for example, if temperatures are reaching suboptimal or stressful levels for a particular population in a particular cave, managers might choose to limit access to the entire cave or just part of the cave where that species occurs to reduce disturbance and hopefully give the species more time for local adaptation. So that's going to be a method that is pretty familiar to most managers. There might also be things we can do on the surface, again, conserving forest cover. Forests are also habitats for lots of species. There are also these new pilot interventions to provide these big insect lights outside of caves to hopefully improve bat foraging opportunities and hopefully their ability to survive hibernation while they're facing the threat of white nose syndrome. So again, these interventions won't be feasible or appropriate for everyone or for every cave. They are potential tools in a toolbox. And then finally, we've compiled this list of supporting actions that make all those other actions possible. So maybe not as flashy, but they are important things to remember. So this includes things like conducting threat assessments and creating management plans that specifically consider climate change and climate resilience, as well as research and monitoring efforts to collect data that can aid management decisions. And hopefully some of the data that we collected for this project can serve as baselines for those future monitoring studies. So I suppose the bad news here is that the challenge is that cave ecosystems are fragile potentially, so it's easy for climate change and human actions to disrupt cave climates, and this can negatively impact biodiversity and ecosystem function. But the good news is that we do have a lot of management options to help keep climates in communities to be resistant or resilient to climate change. And the actions, of course, aren't feasible or acceptable for all caves, but there likely is something there for everyone to try. So we do still have a lot left to do on this project. So I don't know if we'll be back for another webinar. You can look for our upcoming publications. So we already know that we found some important trends in the logger data, and we'll share that after those data and statistical models have been peer reviewed. The next step is tying all of those microclimate data to our biosurvey data to show how cave communities are related to microclimates. And at a small scale, that's important for our individual partners to know what's happening in their individual caves. And then at a large scale, it's important for us to think about maybe projecting how climate change might influence these systems in the future. So those are things that we're actively working on now. And then we're also working on finalizing our management toolbox. So that includes summarizing the evidence and consideration for all the management actions compiled by our partners in the literature review, many of which we talked about today. But there are other examples that we didn't cover that are maybe more rare, and all of them will be included in that final toolbox. So that's where I'm going to end for today. I want to again thank our partners for all their work on this and thank all of you for tuning in today. I am going to take questions. We have lots of time for questions, I think. But if you come up with a question later and you want to reach out, please do feel free to email us at the email addresses below. Thank you very much.